Today, we're not going to talk self-help. In fact, at the start of my interview with Adriel Booker in just a couple of moments' time, she'll reference the fact that there's lots of self-help books for people in the middle of a crisis. But what about between the crisis and when change happens? There's not too many books about that. It's the long, slow, boring part of life, but things that we all go through. Adriel's spent some time thinking about it, from a Christian faith perspective, a trust in a God who really loves us. What does those times really mean? You're in for a bit of a treat. We're going to get stuck into this interview in just a moment. Please, before we do, could you consider rating, reviewing, sharing this podcast with others, giving it 5 stars, however it is, whatever platform you're on. That just helps us get it out to more people. It's always free. We just love sharing these stories and hopefully helping people head towards a better understanding. All right, let's chat with Adriel. Adriel, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's so good to be here with you today, Clayton.
Tell us, and we're going to get more into the book in a couple of minutes' time, but just give us a bit of the synopsis of, I suppose, why you thought, look, this is a book I want to write, and the 20-second elevator pitch, as it were.
Yeah, I found that there's a lot of books on sort of navigating a crisis. If you could sort of think about any crisis you might have in your life, you can find a book on the subject. For instance, my first book is actually written for families that have experienced pregnancy loss. And that's, a type of crisis and grief that has some universal elements to it, as all grief does, but it's also very niche, very specific. And all crises have books that you can find like that. But what I found was that some of the most tender and complicated times of surviving that sort of a major change and crisis is the aftermath of the crisis. So it's one thing to get through with adrenaline and the grace of God, those initial early days of really fresh loss, tender grief. But what about when the dust settles a little bit, the casseroles have stopped coming from your support network, and you're sort of left wondering, all right, I'm not who I used to be. I'm not who I'm becoming either. I feel like I'm not quite there, but I'm in this confusing middle space. What do I do in this space where I'm sort of questioning my life after the crisis? I might be questioning my identity. I might be questioning God. And really, that's what the book is for. It's for that after crisis.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Looking forward to talking about that because, as you said, it's not often discussed. You referenced previous book as well. Talk to us about a bit of your story, because I don't think you come to these spaces and write books like this unless you've had to go through some difficult things yourself. And we often talk about this show that we sometimes have to talk about the dark parts of life before we can talk about the light and the impact of what that is. Could you talk to us about some of those spaces that has led you to think, hey, I've got to write a book like this, and some of your personal journey?
I can. And it's wonderful that you talk about the light and shade, because I think as humans, we're always experiencing both. And we often sort of think that there's categories in our life that are just light and others where just shade, and seasons that are just light and just shade, but so often they're intermixed, and I think that's part of the nuance of growing up and becoming adult, is to realize that often you're experiencing those things simultaneously. I know for my husband and I, we had, when we started our childbearing years, they were full of light and hope and, wonder. And we had 2 children. And then sort of out of nowhere with our 3rd pregnancy, we lost it. And we just didn't see that coming when losing the baby. But we did sort of understand the statistics, and we knew that that's a possibility. And so we proceeded to try and grow our family, thinking that, okay, well, we've sort of ticked that statistical box. Everything's going to be fine. Let's get back to having live babies. And I say that as if, I don't mean to say that as if it wasn't a huge traumatic event for us. It actually was deeply traumatic. But we went on to then experience 2 more successive pregnancy losses after that. And so we had this season of sort of intense grief upon grief upon grief, sort of a compounding grief in that time. We had another live child. And so we've got 3 in our home now. And then after that, we had another loss. And so we sort of had these several years of grief upon grief, a compounding grief. Intermixed in that was COVID. We had been in full-time ministry for 23 years. COVID completely upended our ministry and what that looked like. Um, we ended up making an interstate move, throwing in the mix. I'm not giving you a chronological story, but the big picture is sort of that we had many years of compounding grief, of lots of change. Some was beyond our control, some was within our control. And within that, we really had to grapple with big questions. Where is God in the midst of this? Where does our theology sort of hold up? Where does it have holes? Where does it wear thin? And I guess that's really when, for many of us, when crisis happens in our life, that's where the rubber hits the road and we start to go, okay, what about my faith is resilient enough to make it through this season? And what needs to be re-examined? I think for my husband and I, we always worked with people, and we saw this pattern repeat with folks over and over again, that once they'd hit crisis, some people's faith would fall apart, straight away. But other people's faith, it's like it would grow roots during that time, and it would be solidified during that time. But we also found that when the dust settled after that, then even those deep roots sometimes felt dry. I know I'm mixing metaphors here, but it would sort of, we saw this pattern over and over again where people would really begin to, that's sort of when they might begin deconstruction or pulling their faith apart, which I think is sometimes thought of as something really scary and a bad thing. But I personally see that as part of growth and life in God, that there's seasons of pulling things apart and examining and seeing what works. And so I think for us and for me, one thing that really remained true during those difficult years was I had this sort of abiding conviction and belief that no matter sort of what I think about my own life and what's going on, I had a deep belief that God is good. And so that became my grid to run theology through and to run my own life experiences through. And I guess, and I don't want to sound sort of too lofty with this, but I really took offense to people that would put forth a theology that would, I guess, cast God in a light that's anything less than good. And as a Bible teacher, that's my background, I just had this growing conviction that I want to be able to write about the goodness and kindness of God that actually holds up in the face of scrutiny. We sometimes get really caught up on difficult theological issues and bury them under the fact that actually God really is good underneath all of that. And so how do we sort of spend our Christian lives uncovering God's goodness even when life is hard? So really for me, that's where the conviction was stirred to write about these things. I never set out to say, oh, I'm just going to write about the hardest stuff. No, I don't think anyone does. But, when that's what you experience, that's what you've got to draw from. And so, you begin to see the need around you and go, I don't have all the answers, but I do think I can meet people in that space. And, that feels like a ministry of companionship, if you will.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think often there is questions around those hard things. What are those hard things in life, and how do we ask God those questions around them? And I think what I'm hearing from you, if I can reshape it another way as well, is how do we keep asking the hard things? We're sort of good in our life. I mean, we're good in our world at the moment, right? To have focus on a war or something like some tragedy for 2 or 3 days, and then the news cycle moves on and we sort of forget about some natural disaster or whatever it might be. But there's ongoing consequences for people in where an earthquake has happened or a tsunami for literally years and years and years and years, and maybe a generation until there is recovery. That happens in our lives as well with our crises, with our areas, and as you said, keep asking those questions too. Could I talk to you a bit around? I'm fascinated a bit around that idea of even the byline of what you said. You talked about this quiet kindness of God, and you talked about this idea that says, He is good. And I'm assuming you're not trying to say people can't question, hey, are you good? I think that's actually part of the process. But you
Absolutely.
use this phrase, the quiet kindness of God. Could you give us a definition of what that means versus just the kindness of God, or something that perhaps you were comparing it to?
Yeah, absolutely. Clayton, do you remember a few years ago when, I don't know, social media was really taking off, and maybe this was right around COVID. I don't know the exact timeline, but I remember seeing these videos over and over in my feeds with people doing these really sort of showy acts of kindness on social media.
Yeah.
And these videos were going viral. You know, it might be someone buying flowers for a stranger, or paying for a stranger's groceries, or giving, someone experiencing homelessness a blanket, or all these sort of things. And often these videos, that they'd be going viral for a reason, right? Because you'd watch these videos, and you'd get the warm fuzzies going, oh, look at their needs being met. You'd see a genuine hug at the end, or someone tearing up, how much it meant to them. But I always wondered, like, how many of those videos shot didn't make it on social media because people were offended by being filmed, or feeling like the kindness was performative or showy or not genuine, And so I always felt a bit mixed about seeing those videos, because on the one hand, I'm going, oh, it's great to see people's generosity, and maybe it inspires you to be generous with a stranger. But also, what are your motives for being generous there? Is it to get a viral video so that you can earn money? And it feels very convoluted. And so I chose the term the quiet kindness of God, because I think that although God does sometimes perform wonders, I mean, of course, and you probably have a few personal stories. I know I do, of things that were very wild and almost showy that God has done for me and for our family over the years, a few miraculous things. More often than not, God doesn't move in those big splashy ways. Often God is moving in the everyday moments, the everyday conversations we have, that, 12th day of reading scripture when you wake up in the morning, where actually, oh, today a verse jumped out, but I haven't had that for a while, and it's those small, quiet things. And what I really wanted to show during, in the book Tethered to Hope, was that often God shows up with quiet kindness, and it's not to be a splashy, drawing attention to God's self, but it's to meet us in those normal everyday moments. I think also, Clayton, when you are experiencing a change, or an in-between season, or the aftermath of a crisis, everything can feel noisy and loud and sort of heightened. And sometimes it can feel really difficult to hear God. I'm saying air quotes for listeners, to hear God, or to see God, to recognize God. And so what I want to do is help readers to slow down, quiet ourselves, our minds, our hearts, enough that we can perceive that even in those loud, difficult seasons when everything's pulling at us, that there's still evidence, maybe a quiet evidence, of God's kindness intermixed through there. And so, yeah, choosing the word quiet to incorporate into that subtitle was very intentional. Because as I said, I think there's times when God does turn up in showy ways, but never for God's selfish means. It's never performative to get something out of us. It's just always for our benefit. And it's always, to bless us and to show us God's goodness and reassure us that we are still within God's care, even when things feel difficult.
Adriel Booker is my guest. She's author of the book Tethered to Hope. It is currently on the Australian Christian Shortlist Book of the Year for 2026. As we've been saying, that byline, the quiet kindness of God in crisis, change, and the spaces in between. We're going to be back in just a couple of minutes' time with Adriel, and we're going to ask her about some of her favourite stories of people that she's heard about who have gone with that quiet kindness of God, understood it in crisis, in change, and also in those spaces in between, which is just a beautiful phrase as well. That's on the way next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Adriel, let's talk a little bit about, I'm assuming that as you write these sort of books, as you're thinking about these topics, you find stories of people who, represent that beautiful, quiet kindness. You've shared a bit of your own story in that way. Are there other stories that you always sort of love to give reference to help people understand what you mean by that quiet kindness in whether it's crisis, change, or those spaces in between?
Yeah, I was just thinking of a story that I might share actually from my own life, and I opened the book on this story. So apologies if you're going to get the book, you'll get a repeat. But I think I love to tell this story because one, it's unusual, but two, I think it sort of helps give us a metaphor for how to look at those in between spaces in our life. Because I'm talking about, that there's crisis on one end and sort of change on the other, but what happens in between the crisis and the change? That's often this tricky liminal space where things feel like they're neither here or there, up or down, that sort of thing. So when I was 25, this was actually for my 25th birthday, I decided I wanted to go skydiving. And, my almost 50-year-old self now is going, oh, dear God, that's insane. But at the time, it just sounded like such a great idea. I rallied a group of friends together and we went skydiving, and everyone was so gracious to let me go first as the birthday girl. And so I went out and, as just a tourist, an experienced person, you're strapped to an instructor. So they're really the ones that do the work. You just have to follow instructions. Now, I have to say right up front, I'm not one of those people that pursues adrenaline. Like, I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't sort of pursue that sort of thrill necessarily. But what I did get really excited about was the floating down. I just imagined, and I was living in Southeast Queensland at the time. So I was just imagining this clear, sunny, warm day of floating through the sky, seeing as far as the eye can see, having these great epiphanies about life and adulthood, So I'm up there with the instructor, and that first bit of tumbling out of the plane it's quite nerve-wracking. You sit on the edge, and then they say, "Okay, fall forward," and then you enter this free fall. Now, the free fall is like, you imagine a semi-truck rushing down the highway at 110K or something. Like, the force of the free fall is like that. You're going very fast. The air pressure against you makes your skin flap. Again, it's intense. But then the parachute opens, and there's a small chute that opens that provides some drag, and then the large chute opens, and then you have this beautiful, drift. What happened with us is that the first parachute did not open. And so the mechanism failed to open. And so the full parachute opened. So I went from a free fall at, 110K an hour or whatever, to a hard opening where the big chute opened. And so I don't remember all this sort of, the numbers, but you go from this massive, fast drop to this jolt. The jolt was so big that it knocked me unconscious. Now, the instructor is on my back, strapped behind me. The harnesses cut across my chest, knocked me unconscious. I woke up to him hitting me with my own hands. He had his hands on my wrist, hitting me, saying, wake up, what year is it? Who's the president? Who's the prime minister? Talk to me. And I was sort of in and out of consciousness down for the rest of that parachute ride. I think this instructor had done 2,000 jumps over his career. That had never happened before. So it was obviously an anomaly. The force was so hard, I kid you not, that I wore contact lenses at the time. My contacts were out of my eyeballs, stuck to the inside of the goggles. They popped out of my eyes. That's how hard the force was. Okay, so I love to tell this story because I think often we feel like when we go through a change, we are looking for that transition that will help us get from one place to another, where we have time to look around, adjust to our surroundings, take it all in, decide how we're going to land, decide what we're doing next. But for me, and what I've experienced often after a crisis is like the hard opening of that parachute. It knocks everything out of you. Your whole vision is blurred. Your lenses are popped out. You can't see the way you used to. You're in and out of consciousness. You don't know what's going on. And when I started to write this book and explore the topic of being tethered to hope, I was sort of coming at it from the angle of like, how do I, as a Christian, stay tethered to God, stay tethered to hope? What do I need to do? What are the practices that I need to employ to keep me tethered? And what I realized, even in the writing of this book, and I had this moment where I was actually really struggling with the manuscript and with the perspective on it all. And I felt like God just showed me, Adriel, you don't have to stay tethered to hope. Hope stays tethered to you. You don't have to stay tethered to me. I stay tethered to you, and it was like that, me falling out of that parachute and having that hard opening. It did not go the way I planned, but thankfully my instructor was still, harnessed to me. My instructor was calling the shots. My instructor was safely landing the chute. Had it been up to me, it could have been lethal, catastrophic, Have something happened to the instructor, it could have been lethal or catastrophic. But because the instructor was fine and it was just me that was flailing, we ended up okay. And that's, I guess, the metaphor that I want to share with you and with your listeners, is that often when we're in these in-between spaces, these liminal spaces where we're kind of suspended between what used to be and what's going to be, we can feel like we have no bearings, we have no control, we don't know which way is up or down. We don't even know how to open the chute. We don't know what went wrong. We don't know if we're going to be okay. But at the end of the day, we have an instructor strapped to us that is going to guide us through. And so to me, that was just such an incredible revelation and comfort to realize that I don't need to stay tethered to hope, but actually hope stays tethered to me. And that way we're able to even give ourselves so much grace when we don't feel, again, air quotes, when we don't feel hopeful, when we don't feel a sense of hope, because we don't always, we don't always feel hopeful. But that doesn't mean that hope doesn't exist and that hope doesn't continue to hold us despite how we feel. And I think that's such an important takeaway for us to chew on and turn over in our lives to see how does that actually apply to us when we're feeling like we're in that weird in-between space.
Yeah. What a great reminder. And I suppose I'm also an encouragement if you're listening at the moment and you're thinking, well, actually, I don't really have that same idea of faith or hope. That, I think there is many, many people over literally millennia who would say that is exactly God's character, that he will tether to you rather than you have to hold on. And that takes away from the performative nature of what many believe faith is about as well. Can we talk about some practical examples too, Adriel, around this idea that says, how do we respond? We've just talked about God will be tethered to us in hope, and what an incredible encouragement that is. And so because of that, when we're in that crisis and we haven't experienced that change yet, that is fully there, what are some practical ways to actually truly live in the hope of what that is, rather than maybe just hold on? Although there's validity, I think, in just holding on at times.
Sure, there's times where we do just need to hold on. I think one of the things I would say is really a mindset that helps us to understand that sort of in between and that liminal space doesn't last forever. And that's something that, you can't really you can't really change your mind just by employing a practice, but it's about reassuring yourself that, and I don't mean it, I don't mean this in a cliche way to say this too shall pass, because not every crisis pass. Sometimes we have to live with the consequences of a loss. We have to live with the consequences of a diagnosis, etc. But that feeling of being out of sorts, that doesn't last forever. And so I think that one of the things we need to do is sort of remind ourselves and put reminders in our lives and help with community that we trust, remind one another that this sort of in between ambiguous liminal space, it doesn't last forever. One of the things, just on a really practical level, that's helped me to keep reminding myself of that when things are hard is to practice self-compassion. And you see compassion used throughout the Gospels. You see there's so many times when there's a story of Jesus, and it often follows this little, I don't want to call it a formula, but it often follows this pattern where Jesus is moved with compassion and ... He's first moved with compassion and then he heals someone. He's moved with compassion and then he invites someone to a meal. He's moved with compassion and he sees someone set free. And it starts with this compassion that is from deep within, but compassion results in action. And so I think sometimes it can be easier to have compassion on other people because our hearts are moved when we see others in pain. But it can be really difficult to have a level of compassion with ourselves. We think like, oh, I should be fine. So-and-so has it worse. Or, this city just experienced catastrophic earthquake. Or, there's always something worse to compare our circumstance to. And so it can be hard to have compassion on ourselves. We can feel like if I could just maybe pray more or have more faith or XYZ, I'll be fine. But actually to practice self-compassion in these times is so important. But self-compassion isn't just a sort of a nice way of looking at ourselves, but it's a movement toward action. What does it mean to practice compassion in this situation? Well, it means letting myself off the hook for not having all my beliefs lined up like ducks in a row, or not having all of my questions answered. I can actually be okay with the fact that there's some loose ends, some outstanding questions. So I think self-compassion is really important. I think another thing that's really important is giving ourselves permission to ask hard questions of God and ask hard questions of the institutions that we've trusted. I found in my own life that when I come with a lot of cynicism and a heart that's feeling a bit hard with my hard questions, I don't often find the answers I'm seeking. But when I come with the hardest, most accusational, most pointed questions toward God, and yet in my heart, I'm going, God, I really do want you to answer these. If there's a sort of a softness around the questions, I find that God meets me there, and it's not that God can't get through our hardness. God can do whatever God wants. But I find that like leaning in those times and trying to keep my heart soft toward answers that may or may not appease my curiosity or my doubt has helped me to engage with those hardest questions, and finding safe people, around me that I can be genuine with is really important. And you see that throughout scripture too, probably if people have grown up going to Sunday school or any familiar with some of the kind of hero Bible stories, we know the story of Jacob wrestling, with the angel of the Lord. And I often think of that time of wrestling where Jacob is after something. He's after something, but he's persistent. And we can think of it as sort of a fight and a conflict. And yes, there's elements of that there, but I also think it's important to realize that that wrestling metaphor is so important because for two people to wrestle, there's like an intimacy. There's a face to face, an exchange of, sweat and touch. And, you're seeing each other, you're hearing each other, you're there on the mat together. It's not a one-way thing, but it's a two-way thing. And so to really engage ourselves with God is sort of not counting God out in those difficult seasons, but saying, God, I want to engage with you. And that can be difficult, but a profound experience of really entering that metaphorical mat, to be able to wrestle with God on some of those things that we find challenging.
Yeah. We've often said on this program that God can handle the tough questions. And in fact, actually, if this God, this Jesus is who he really says he is, then you have to be able to ask tough questions. The truth can stand up to those questions of what there is. So I think that's something really important, something to hold on to as people think through that. But likewise, to come at it with that idea of actually hearing. So often we can approach that in a story-based, right, way. Someone can hear someone's story and go, well, this is how I could change life. Or someone could hear a story and go, well, I'm never going to change anyway. So that's just a silly story that someone's telling. We've got an opportunity. Which way would we approach each of the circumstances that we have in our life? Adriel, final question from me. As somebody reads Tethered to Hope and they sort of get to that last page, they put it down, what do you hope that they walk away with?
Well, I referenced this earlier, but I think it's worth saying again. I think really the core message of the book is that you're already tethered to hope. And I hope that that theme is repeated throughout every chapter of the book when we look at different metaphors for describing our circumstances, when we look at different language, when we look at different ways of relating to God, different ways of relating to ourselves. I hope that all of those things will have a through line of reinforcing this one truth that no matter how we feel, no matter what life throws at us, that through it all, there is still a tether that remains. And maybe it's important to say here, when I say that we're tethered to God or God is tethered to us, I don't mean like a leash that keeps us from drifting off. I mean like an umbilical cord, right? Like it's a tether that has like a life purpose in it. There's a life flowing two ways, two directions, from mother to baby, from God to human, and it flows both ways, and it's a connection that keeps us tethered and in relationship and in intimacy. But it's not restrictive, but it's life-giving. And I think that is really what I would hope to leave people with, is a sense of their strong tether that can hold up to scrutiny, that can hold up to the most difficult of life scenarios, and can be that comfort that we all need for those middle spaces when we just need to know that, one, we're not alone, and two, this thing is not going to last forever.
Adriel, thank you so much for writing the book, thinking about it, and thinking about this area that doesn't get all that much focus on. It is so important for us, and thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Adriel Booker is the author of the book Tethered to Hope, The Quiet Kindness of God in Crisis, Change, and Spaces in Between, here on Towards Understanding.